Hi everyone, this is John Gerardi with Right to Life of Central California, bringing you another in our 40 videos for 40 days series. 40 Days for Life is the international campaign of prayer and presence outside abortion clinics throughout the country and throughout the world. If you want to learn more about our campaign outside the Planned Parenthood Clinic on Fulton Street in Fresno, get in touch with us at Right to Life at 559-229-2229. Today on the show, we're going to continue talking about the topic of physician-assisted suicide, another topic that we at Right to Life another practice that we at Right to Life very fervently oppose. I want to describe for you one of the real problems with the physician-assisted suicide problem. Obviously, its existence, the core idea that the state is sanctioning people committing suicide is the most grievous problem. But I want to address another issue that sort of, in an attempt to dispel this frequent pro-assisted suicide talking point, which is the possibility for various kinds of abuse in the system, whereby people might be getting murdered without us knowing it. So one of the big arguments that was made on behalf of physician-assisted suicide when it was introduced in the California legislature, where it eventually passed in 2015, was to look at the states of Washington and Oregon, which have had physician-assisted suicide for a much longer period of time. And the claim was made that, look, in 20 years of assisted suicide being legal in some states, there's essentially no reports of any kind of abuse in the system, of someone claiming that this is what their grandma wanted and trying to, get the inheritance. No reports, no incidents of abuse. It's a very safe and secure system. Now, the problem is basically the setup for physician-assisted suicide is such that it eliminates your ability to catch fraud and abuse in that way. Let me explain what I mean. You qualify for physician-assisted suicide if you have received a 6-month terminal diagnosis. Now, we don't need to get into the loosey-goosiness of a 6-month terminal diagnosis, all right? It's not like if you get a diagnosis like that, at 5 months and 30 days, you'll be fine, and at 5 months and 31 days, you'll immediately drop dead. It's a guess. It's a good faith guess on the doctor's part, but frankly, there are people who receive a 6-month terminal diagnosis who die 3 months later and who die 30 years later. Okay? It's a guess. And I think not that any prediction is a sound enough prediction to take your own life on its basis, but it's certainly not a firm enough basis to make a literal life and death decision. So physician-assisted suicide is open to any person with a 6-month terminal diagnosis. Let's suppose you have a 6-month terminal diagnosis. You seek out physician-assisted suicide. You get a doctor to prescribe you basically life-ending pills. You get a bottle of these pills. You take them whenever you want at your leisure. You kill yourself. So 2 things that are really problematic. One is that you don't need to take that medication, really poison. You don't need to take that medication in the presence of a physician. And most people who participate in physician-assisted suicide do not take it in the presence of a physician. There's no requirement for someone to be around. There's no requirement for anything to be recorded. There's no requirement for anything to be monitored. The next thing to note is the death certificate of the person who kills himself via physician-assisted suicide. If I receive a 6-month terminal diagnosis for, let's say, lung cancer, and I seek out, I get a prescription for physician-assisted suicide drugs, I take the drugs, and I die from those drugs, the doctor is required under California law to put as my cause of death not physician-assisted suicide, not the drugs from physician-assisted suicide, but rather lung cancer, the underlying condition that allowed me to qualify for physician-assisted suicide in the first place. So often, the death certificate, what's reported on the death certificate, is not a sufficient basis for even initiating the kinds of investigations, for example, an autopsy or something, that could or should be done in the event that someone maybe influenced this elderly person to take the drugs when they didn't want to. It's also important to note that a lot of people who request life-ending drugs never wind up following through, never wind up actually taking the medication because it's up to them. They might change their mind. and many of them do. So the question is, what, from an evidentiary perspective, what ways can we actually collect evidence to find out whether or not, for example, an ambitious or greedy potential heir of this person who is near the end of his or her life, whether that person might try to secure that person's death through a request for physician-assisted suicide, whether undue influence is being exerted. The protections just aren't in place. And in fact, the state of Oregon did have a number of cases where these things were sort of raised as real questions about the integrity of the system. That maybe there are some people who are genuinely not just dying from suicide, but genuinely being murdered through various forms of abuse. At the very least, it is a very insecure system and should never have been legalized in the first place. For Right to Life of Central California, I'm John Gerardi.